joined us today for this webinar. All about self as instrument. And as we go through the next 30 minutes, I think useful to think of this as almost an introductory session, because we're really conscious that this will potentially create as many questions as it might answer. And of course, that's okay. So depending on what does emerge as we go through it, we'll probably pick up some of those themes for a further webinar next year. So we're delighted that you can all join us. And you can see that I'm, of course, joined by my dear friends and colleagues, Monica and Damion. Damion, as many of you know, is the founder of Catalyst Wonfor and has been an executive coach and coach trainer and supervisor for many years. And Monica similarly is a faculty member with us and supervisor. And between the two of them, they have a wealth of experience in this field. So I'm delighted to be joining them today. So just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. So you're all on listen only mode today. So we're going to be encouraging you to put some things into the chat panel just to sort of contribute some thinking and some of your experiences to our conversation. We will record the session. So Damien's pressed record already, and we will put it onto our YouTube channel early next week. So download it. So first thing we'd like to do actually, just as we head into the session, is just to get you to reflect on a couple of questions for yourselves. So, you know, the idea of self and instrument, of course, it has many layers to it, many strands to it. But I suppose just from your experience, what is it that you are really interested to learn in the next 30 minutes? You know, what's going to be really useful for you? And just take a minute or so just to put that into the chat panel, because it will help us as we go through the conversation. So just what is it that you're really interested to learn about self as instrument? And you can just share it with everybody in the chat panel. So thank you, Kirsty. So thank you, Kat. So what does it mean? Yeah. And Sarah, lovely comment. What happens if I'm out of tune? Okay, so lovely. So some themes already just about, you know, what is it? How does it show up? And also, what does it mean for me as the coach? So how might I bring more of this and more of myself into my coaching sessions? And thank you, Mazia. You know, that sense of, is it my stuff? Is it the coachee stuff? You know, how do I work with that? And thank you, Kelly. So how to be present and helpful without leading the other. So thank you. So there may be some more that are about to pop up. So thank you, Anne-Sophie. So it's useful just to have that as a little bit of a backdrop to our conversation. So just take it a little bit further. So another question for you, and some of this, it may have been already in your sort of reflections. And some of you have actually asked the question, what is it? But actually, if you just sit with what it is, when you hear it as a phrase, self as instrument, what does it connect you to? So what does it mean for you in terms of your awareness at the moment? And again, just share a little bit in the chat panel, and then we'll get started in the conversation. So just what does it mean to you at the moment? So thank you, Gina. So intuition, sensing and trusting. So, and we're going to touch on a little bit different ways of knowing. So that will be part of that. Thank you, Martin, to be embodied in the coaching space. And again, Laura, using myself with awareness. Oh, that's a nice one. A lightning conductor for my client. I like that as a metaphor. So Kelly, thank you about creating something and tolerating ambiguity. So these are lovely. So thank you. We'll just wait for a few more to come in. Thank you, Phil. And thank you, Isabel. So that idea of bringing presence-based reflections to the conversation. Okay, so thank you, everybody. It's really helpful just to have those brought into the conversation. So let's start the conversation with just some thoughts around what it is. So Damion, I'm going to bring you in first, just to kick us off. So when you hear self as instrument, what is it for you?
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, and I think I wanted to start with this a bit of reflection of my own experience, actually, because I can remember someone once saying to me that, you know, as a coach, you're the most powerful and potent tool in the conversation. And I can remember when I was learning as a coach, I was thinking, like, you know, that seems a bit of a stretch for me, in terms of what actually does this mean. So I wanted to share a couple of examples just to start to explore this. And I'm sure Monica will want to come in as well and just build on what I'm sharing. So for me, there's something about being a mirror. And I think sometimes, you know, this capacity enables us to tune in and reflect back what we're experiencing. And so we might do that explicitly. So, you know, recently I've been listening to one of my coaching clients who's very angry about a situation he's facing in the organization to do with a change that's happening. You know, and as I was listening to him, I could feel physically that I was constricting. You know, my breath was high and I was feeling really, really tense, you know, that sort of constricting feeling we sometimes get, you know, and I offered that to him. As I'm listening to you, I noticed that I get a felt sense of, you know, struggling to breathe, and I'm feeling really constricted. I'm wondering what's happening for you. You know, so sometimes we might offer that as a way of what we're experiencing. Other times it may be less explicit and informing our intervention. So I think the second part of this for me is this is a data source to help us inform our interventions with impact. And another practical example, you know, again, recently listening to a client, again, in a very difficult situation because of the organizational change that's happening, you know, and as I was listening and noticing her, and this was online, it appeared to me she got smaller. So that's the best way I can describe it. She got smaller and younger as the conversation progressed. And I didn't think she was ready to hear what I was noticing. So it informed a question. And the question I asked her was, you know, how are you making yourself smaller in this situation? You know, so I think sometimes this idea of mirroring our experience, but also when we're modeling, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but sometimes it's informing the interventions that we make to have most impact. And when we were preparing for this session, I just want to share some quotes that I think are useful when we're starting to get into this space. So I'm just going to put some quotes on the screen, and I'm sure, you know, people have come across these before. But the quote, you know, that appears on our website from Wonfor Sharma: the success of any intervention depends on the inner being of the intervener, which really connects to Eunice's definition of self as instrument, really. You know, the quality of our inner self shapes our capacity to hold the space and intervene powerfully with those we are working with. It is the self who we are being, our presence, that is the instrument through which we work and through which we live our lives. And so for me, fundamentally, this is all about our presence and the presence that we're holding in the space with our clients. So I'm just going to pause there and just see if Monica wants to come in at all.
Yeah, what you've said, Damion, you know, really resonates with me. And I suppose one of the things I want to offer is that, first of all, it's a journey. You know, it's part of the maturing that happens as you go through the journey of, you know, first you move from finding your way as a coach with the different models. And so it's a process to learn to trust yourself deeply. And the other is, for me, it's about simplicity. It's about not adding anything into the space. It's about really coming into the space, having worked with yourself, and that's a constant thing that you do. In fact, quite often I will notice what's coming up in me even before I connect with a client. Sometimes I pick up the energy before I sit down. So I might find myself suddenly having a pain in my heart and wondering, oh, that's interesting. That wasn't there when I woke up this morning. And just holding it lightly and noticing sometimes it comes up in the words that somebody expresses. And I think, okay, wow. And so it's being attentive to everything in yourself, to everything in the space. I think that's the piece I'd like to add.
Yeah.
And
actually, just listening to the two of you talking about it. Go on, Damion.
Sorry, I was just going to add, because I think there's this piece. I know some people on the chat panel have mentioned this aspect of trust. And as we start to build practices, and I know we'll talk about these, that really support us to access these different sources of information around our experience, we start to develop this capacity to learn to trust this as well. Because it does, it is a bit of a stretch, I would say, when we're first working in this way. But actually, when we start to learn to trust in this innate wisdom that we're accessing, the people that are trained with us and are training with us, we talk about the 4 ways of knowing, the cognitive, the emotional, the intuitive, and the somatic embodied knowing. And these are, capacities that we're accessing when we're in this space. It's information that we're noticing, and obviously it's underpinned by our intention. Who's this for? What's this for? So yeah, I just wanted to add that bit in, Liz.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and it connects with what I was going to say, because again, listening to the two of you, and of course we work very closely together, the thing that also strikes me about it is we can also, each of us, experience it in quite different ways. So there's something about really tuning into what it is for us and not judging ourselves if it isn't the same as for someone else. So there's something about just getting really tuned into, how I pick up this sense of whatever it is and how I share it, because it will be different for each of us. So Monica, from your experience, how does it sort of that self-awareness piece?
So, self-awareness is something, I suppose, again, that's built over time. And for me, it's more than self-awareness. It's a real conscious choice to it's an awareness at a different level, because you're not just kind of saying, oh yeah, I know myself and I know what's going on, I can sense something here, or even being aware of the other and what's going on. And then it's actually it's another step into depth, and it's about being conscious and choosing consciously to work with yourself. And that means cultivating yourself. It means paying attention at a greater level. It means creating space, actually, more often, more space, more reflection, so that it's not just something you fall into and you suddenly notice, that you're actually working with this all the time. So for me, it's a very conscious thing.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Monica. Damion, how about for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're embodying something every moment of the day, and if we think about, I appreciate Monica and me work together a lot with embodied training for coaches, but there's sort of sense of embodiment being qualities that we're expressing. And, we know from social neuroscience that we're affected by what other people are embodying, but I think picking up on Monica's point is, if we don't create the space to really connect to this deeper awareness, often as we start to be impacted by something, perhaps it's an agitation because of everybody being in the second lockdown. There's fears about the future. What can happen is we start to make it about us, perhaps, when actually if we've got space and we've got the recovery time, we can actually tune in and be more, I suppose, have that meta awareness of, you know, is this mine? Is this the coachee's? And I think that's the other piece of the awareness for me, is the metacognition, reflexivity, being able to notice that in the moment. But that doesn't, as Monica is saying, that doesn't happen by chance. That happens from having a practice that enables us to be in that space.
So Monica, it's almost like a very conscious practice, conscious choice that I make to continually work on it, that then enables me to tune into what's more unconscious.
Exactly. And actually it's interesting.
What's going on.
I have my tuning forks here with me, which I often use as a metaphor, because a lot of people mentioned music and tuning in. And these are two different keys. I won't demonstrate it now, but when I ding one of them, it's one key. And when I ding the other, it's another. When I put the two together, it's one key. And for me, that's about the coach being, conscious about how they're showing up, how they've cultivated themselves before they enter the space, and therefore how they invite the person into kind of regulating themselves first and then regulating the other, so that there's space for the person to come into, even if they're affected by things like COVID-19 or something going on in their life. So it's very much about consciousness and building a container for themselves and for their clients.
Yeah, lovely. So I know we're sort of heading into this, in terms of where it's taken us in the conversations. So Damion, from your perspective, what makes it important as something that coaches, should pay attention to, should develop?
I've got a quote that I just wanted to put up on the screen, which some of you may have read the article that a lot of OD practitioners came across, in terms, it's called The Self as an Instrument, a Cornerstone of the Future of OD. And this is quite a nice quote in terms of, I suppose, the work Monica was talking about in terms of developing ourselves, because the reality is coaching, as we know, is anxiety provoking, isn't it? It can create fear in the coaching client. So that sort of piece of what Monica was saying about us regulating ourselves and going into the coaching space in a more neutral state, we can start, as we start to notice and experience perhaps this sense of anxiety that may be present, we're regulating ourselves and therefore able to create more space. So we're not being impacted by it, because we know our own patterns as much as we can. Obviously, we're always learning, and this is where supervision comes in. But we know our patterns and when we're impacted. So, I therefore don't cause it to be an intervention if I know it's my pattern. Perhaps I'm feeling nervous because it's the first time I've worked with a chief exec, and I feel the anxiety, and I regulate myself and work with that, compared to I'm feeling anxious. As this conversation goes on, I'm noticing that energy increasing. And the reason I think this is important is this thing around the different dynamics that are at play in the coaching process, and we all know about this. What is really happening now, and the reality is, we know that our conscious attention is limited, and actually when we're in big periods of immense pressure like we are at the moment, actually what we're paying attention to is affected as well. They say that we're hit by 11 million bits of information, and the conscious attention can only process 60 bits of it. So a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of what's below the surface line in the subconscious, in terms of what we may be sensing, feeling physically, what our intuition is telling us, what we're feeling emotionally, is often subconscious. So there's a sort of sense here where we're using it as an instrument to really sense in and understand where the coachee is. And this is the sort of one of the final slides I show, but it links to our sort of transformational coaching model, where we're talking about getting beneath the waterline, you know, in terms of creating an energetic or embodied shift in the coachee. And again, you know, the way we do that is often through mirroring and role modeling for the client. So by us sharing our process, we're helping them pay attention, their limited attention to what they're experiencing. So therefore we can create more of this embodied sense, this embodied shift that's happening in the coaching session. So I say that's why it's an important tool, but as Monica says, it's something we develop over time.
And Monica, anything that you would add just hearing that from Damion?
My sense is it's important to be aware of, I talk about constellating our clients and being aware of, we often attract clients who are similar to ourselves or might have similar stories. And, in supervision, for example, to be able to look at, whoa, what's in my field and what's the change I need to make because I'm actually affecting that field. But it's also about, as I mentioned earlier, being conscious around cultivating yourself through practices. I saw somebody mention that they have a mindfulness practice there in the chat. So, daily practices, to do them when you don't need them is actually really important, because what happens is you're teaching your body slowly to have greater capacity to hold something. And then when it's actually needed, the body already knows how to do it. So if, for example, you only just bring something in just when you need it, it's going to be so new that your body won't have integrated it. So things like mindfulness, centering, yoga, any of the practices that many of you have, walking, reflective walking, mindful walking, anything that brings you to a place of slowing down, listening to yourself, befriending your own body and your own awareness. These are all things that help.
Yeah, lovely. And I think really important to find something that really does work for you.
Yes.
So you've mentioned a number of ways in which I can be more mindful. And journaling, of course, is another way that helps me slow down and just pay attention to what's happening for me. So
being in nature, for example, it can be very simple.
Absolutely. And as you said, mindful walking, of course, anything that it really is that present moment awareness, isn't it, for ourselves and for what's around us, so that we can really tune into that.
And just to add, with that quotation, there was the bit about sort of being aware of your own patterns, your own family and kind of patterns in terms of gender and so for example, to be aware of where your interference might come in and to work on that, to take courses maybe that help you to neutralize or to understand that better, so that you're not bringing that into the space.
Yeah. And Damion, I know you have a lovely quote about practice. I hope you know which one I'm referring to, because I'm mindful of.
Yeah. In times of adversity, we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to the level of our practice, which is Bruce Lee. Yeah, so that's a quote around practice. But yeah. I think the reality is, especially at the moment, if we're not creating this space, often we're not recovering and resourcing ourselves in the same way. And the self-care piece, which I know everybody listening will be familiar with, but it's so important right now, in terms of us really modeling this for our clients. And I think the other thing is just, our language around this is just the bit I wanted to add in, because for some coaches, this could be a real stretch for them. So actually how we may access this felt sense that we're experiencing or what we're noticing, we may not share it with them in that way. It might be an image that we're sharing. It might, it's the skill of the coach is knowing, or the art of coaching is knowing how to introduce, these I suppose the more novel approaches, if we want to think about it in that way, they're less common, but I think it's about finding a way that translates to the coachee's world as well. That's the skill here. It's not
So,
always me sharing my body sense.
so we've touched a little bit on how we can start to develop it as coaches, through any practice that is a mindful practice about being in the present. So Damion, how you've given some examples, and Monica has, but how can we utilize this in our practice with our coaches?
I think if you're in your early days of coaching, you're getting to grips with the models, maps, frameworks, it can just be as simple to start to develop this capacity is through the use of feedback, and often that might be feedback about the other person. And the reason I'm just suggesting that is because we soon start to realize that the more concise we are about the observations that we're noticing, the more succinct our intervention is, the more impactful it is. And I think then that stands us in good stead when we want to start to introduce our own process. Because I think the challenge for coaches is always, if they're not feeling fully confident in that moment, they're likely to go into an explanatory mode about why they're doing it. So I think one thing I'd say to new coaches is just start to play with this. But if it feels more comfortable, just do it around what you're noticing. There's that wonderful quote by Carl Jung, which gets you banded around so much in coach training, but learn your maps and models well, but set them aside somehow, when you meet the miracle of the human being. And just learning, again, just little strategies that can really enable you to self-regulate and presence in the middle of the session, in the moment, is what I was going to say. So, and again, it's different for everyone. Monica has her embodied centering work. I use mindfulness. So, one of the things that has become a resource for me is my breath, and I use like a somatic marker in my body. So, I'm aware my breath is calm at the start of the session, and then these little moments of noticing when my breath is changing starts to tell me about paying attention. So I think, again, it's finding the way in that works for you. And no one can tell you that. I've trained, I remember when I met Monica and I was training with Monica, and gave myself permission eventually to find my own way in this. And that was the best thing, because then you learn to trust this. This is something that you discover for yourself. You're not learning from somebody else. And then it's about intentionality. I mentioned this earlier, but all the time, when we're checking in our coach training, we talk about the 5 tests. Will this raise awareness, responsibility, choice? Is there enough trust in me as the coach? Is this the right time? But from a meta position, we're talking about, what's my intention? Who's this for? What's this for?
And actually, just to add, Damion, I think being unattached, so being willing for it not to land, and that be okay. Because sometimes it's a matter of timing for people, and sometimes it may just be that you've interpreted something that doesn't land with them, and that's fine. If the door is to open, it will open when it's ready.
Yeah, lovely. And we've had some nice comments in the chat panel, so thank you to Damien's point about finding your own way with this. So finding your own way to develop it, finding your own way to use it with your coachees. As Damion said, it might be an image that you share, it might be a sense that you share. So it really is something about making it your own. So I'm conscious we've got about a minute left. So Monica, just anything that you would add just in the last minute before we wrap this up?
So my sense is that, the most important thing is to recognize that we are human beings meeting other human beings. And, that it's about being respectful, it's about being loving, and about having permission to be a learner and not be perfect. I think, just remember we're all doing our best.
Lovely. What a lovely way to finish as well. So thank you both very much. Thank you to everyone for joining us. It's been lovely to have you with us, and for all those lovely comments in the chat panel. So we're going to save the chat actually, because we're going to reflect on this and use it as a way of thinking about how we can build on this in a webinar for next year. So I'm sure it will be something we come back and revisit. So thank you very much to Monica and Damion. So just to let you know, the next webinar we're going to be hosting is on Monday, the 14th of December, and it leads quite nicely from this because it's all about self-care. And given everything that's happening around us, it feels like that's an important aspect of our work that we pay attention to. And actually then it's going to be very closely followed on the next day by just a webinar on some coaching reflections. So we hope you can join us for both of those. And again, thank you again for joining us today. Go well, everybody. We will catch up with you all soon. So thank you very much.